The signal came in at 0347 hours, station time, and Cassie Voss almost deleted it. She had been awake for 19 hours running diagnostics on the relay array. Deep Anchor Station 12. Humanity's outermost listening post. A tin can bolted to an asteroid 42 light minutes past the heliopause. And her eyes were the kind of tired that made numbers swim and error codes blur into abstract art. The signal was tagged as noise by the autofilter. Subspace static. She had 300 of those in her queue every shift, and she binned them all without a second look. That was her job. Filter, sort, escalate. Nothing romantic about it. But this one had rhythm. She didn't catch it, consciously. Her hand was already moving toward the delete key, when something in the patterns snagged her. The way a distant melody will hook you through the noise of a crowded room before you've even identified it as music. Hand stopped. Her eyes refocused. She pulled the signal back from the bin and ran it through the acoustic processor. The readout showed a carrier wave, modulated. The modulation was irregular, non-mathematical, non-repeating in any way the standard decryption suite could parse. The suite flagged it as corrupted data and suggested she delete it and move on. Cassie took off her headset, closed the diagnostic interface, and put the raw signal through the speakers. What came out of those speakers, thin and warped by 42 light minutes of interstellar medium, was a guitar. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she put her headset back on and started working. The signal was coming from deep, past the boundary markers, where human exploration had ended and the map territories of the Vorkai Dominion began. Cassie had done her orientation briefings on the Vorkai the way everyone at Deep Anchor did, in 3 hours, in one sitting, because there wasn't much to learn that wasn't distressing. The Vorkai were old, they were vast. They had absorbed 47 species in the last 200 years, which the diplomats called integration, and the integrated species, as far as anyone could tell, called something closer to suffocation. The Dominion moved slowly, but it moved with the inexorability of geological time, and its doctrine was simple. Uniformity was order, deviation was disorder, disorder was eliminated. The Dominion had among its many prohibitions, outlawed music. Not the Vorkai's own ritual harmonics, those were preserved, codified, performed only at state occasions and only in prescribed keys. What they had outlawed was what they called resonance, without function. Sound that existed for the sake of itself, for joy, for grief, for the specific human, and apparently non-human, needs to put feeling outside the body and let it move through the air and into other people. They had outlawed it across every absorbed world. They had destroyed instruments. They had imprisoned composers. In the early days of contact, a Vorkai diplomat had explained this to the UN liaison with something that was, Cassie thought, the alien equivalent of confused patience. Why would a productive society devote energy to generating vibrations that produce no physical result? The liaison had asked what physical result the Vorkai got from their own ritual harmonics. The diplomat had not answered. Cassie ran the signal through her direction-finding array and triangulated its origin. A vessel, small, moving at about 60% of Dominion standard cruise velocity, which meant it was either damaged or had a very old engine. It was coming more or less directly toward human space. Behind it, at greater distance but accelerating, were 3 signals that the Threat Assessment Program identified as Dominion pursuit craft. Vorkai interceptors, Class 4, designed for boarding and retrieval. So, refugees. Cassie opened a channel to Station Command. The channel rang for 90 seconds before Commander Reyes picked up, visibly just woken, her hair pressed flat on one side. Foss. It's 4 in the morning. Yes, ma'am, I have a situation. She laid it out in under 2 minutes. Reyes was quiet for most of it, and Cassie had worked with her long enough to know that quiet meant thinking, not sleeping. What's on the signal? Reyes asked. Music, ma'am. Another pause. Music, guitar, possibly also drums, but the carrier degradation is making it hard to separate. There may be vocals. Reyes rubbed her face. Do we have a treaty obligation to? No active treaty covers the heliopause buffer zone. This is our discretion. Cassie waited. She could hear Reyes breathing. How long until they reached the station's shadow? At current velocity, 6 hours. Suit craft will intercept in 4 hours and 40 minutes, assuming they don't accelerate. If the Dominion boards that ship in our buffer zone, it becomes a diplomatic incident. Yes, ma'am. And if we intervene, also a diplomatic incident. Yes, ma'am. So we're having a diplomatic incident either way. That's my read. Reyes was quiet again. Cassie watched the signal traces on her screen. The small blip of the refugee vessel, the 3 cold signatures of the interceptors closing in behind it, steady as a metronome. Power up the long-range array, Reyes said. Let's see if we can talk to them. The refugees were called the Skrull. Cassie learned this over the next hour, in a halting exchange, conducted through the relay array's translation matrix, which was adequate for Dominion standard, but had never been tested against whatever the Skrull spoke natively. What came through was approximate, fragmented, occasionally absurd, but the meaning was clear enough. The Skrull had been a people before the Dominion. They had had cities. They had had art, not just music but painting, dance, a literary tradition that the ship's apparent leader, who gave his name as something the mate as Scree, described as going back 10,000 years. The Dominion had arrived 200 years ago, and they had, in the language of Dominion bureaucracy, integrated the Skrull homeworld. Integration had taken 11 years. By the end of it, the Skrull had a functioning infrastructure, a reliable food supply, a regulated population, and nothing else. Their art was gone. Their instruments were confiscated or destroyed. Their books were reclassified as non-functional data and archived in a way that meant no one could access them. The Skrull worked in the mines now. They worked in the refineries. They worked on the monuments. Every conquered world built monuments, enormous, technically impressive structures that served no purpose except to be very large and to be unmistakably about the Dominion. The current Commander-General, a Vorkai official named Vork Prime, had been in residence on the Skrull homeworld for 40 years. And in those 40 years, his monument had grown from a platform to a tower, to something that was now, by the ship's records, visible from low orbit. They had worked on it every day. Skrull, who still remembered the old songs, had sung them quietly, only among themselves, only underground. Literally underground, in the old mine shafts below the refinery district, where the acoustics were good, and the Dominion overseers rarely went because the air quality index was technically below regulatory standard. Then, about 6 weeks ago, Scree had picked up a signal. The translation matrix rendered his descriptions of this moment in language that was slightly too poetic for technical report. But Cassie didn't try to edit it, he said. The signal was like hearing someone speak your own name in a room where you had been mute for so long you'd begun to wonder if you existed, he said. It was a human voice, singing. He said he had not known what humans were, but the signal told him. The signal had been a commercial radio broadcast. A rock station out of Johannesburg, bouncing off a relay satellite, bleeding into interstellar space with the cheerful indifference of a species that had no idea anyone was listening. Scree had played it for every Skrull who would come to the shafts to hear it. Then they had built a ship. You built a ship, Cassie said, when the translation matrix gave her a clean enough window. Had the parts. Scree's voice through the matrix had a quality she couldn't quite name, something that resonated at a frequency slightly below human speech, so that she felt it as much as heard it. We work in the refineries. We know what things are made of. Some of us remember how machines work from before, and Vrob, you would say. Vrob is our engineer. Vrob is very good with machines that do not belong to her. Cassie thought of the tinkerer type she had known all her life. The ones at mission control who could look at a broken instrument panel and see not what it was, but what it could become. Her father had been like that. He'd had a saying, "The machine doesn't know who built it. It just knows if it's been wired right." How many of you are on board? 11. Plus instruments. You brought instruments. We were not going to leave them. She smiled at the console, alone in the relay room, with the signal traces in the dark. Hey, she said. Okay. I'm going to tell you what I can offer, and you tell me if it's enough. What she could offer was the station's shadow. a broad electromagnetic null zone created by Deep Anchor's own relay array, which when she ran the deflectors at full, would mask a small vessel's drive signature from Dominion sensors for approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes was not enough for the refugee ship to reach the official boundary of human space, but it was enough for them to reach the asteroid belt that the station sat in the middle of. And the asteroid belt was large and cold and full of radar-scattering rock. It would buy them time, maybe not enough, but time. The pursuit craft, Scree said, 3 of them. If they lose our signal, they will search. Yes, you would be drawing their attention. That's my plan. A pause. Through the static, she thought she could hear something. Movement. Maybe voices. The thin ambient sound of a crowded small ship. Why? Scree asked. She'd been expecting the question. She'd been asking herself the same thing since she pulled the signal from the bin. The honest answer had several components, and she gave him all of them. Because what they're doing to your people is wrong, she said. Because you built a ship to chase a song. Because, and I know this is going to sound strange, my grandmother had a saying. She said music is the proof that the universe wants to feel something. She said anything that tries to stamp it out is scared of what it feels. She paused. And because those pursuit craft are in my buffer zone and they haven't asked my permission, and that annoys me professionally. Another pause. Her grandmother was wise, Scree said. She was. She also would have found this entire situation completely normal. 90 minutes was the plan. Cassie got was 40. The Vorkai interceptors accelerated earlier than the tracking program had projected, which meant either they had detected the station's deflector activity, or they were simply standard doctrine opportunists who pressed an advantage the moment it appeared. The lead interceptor hit the buffer zone boundary at a speed that was technically in violation of 3 different diplomatic conventions about navigation near inhabited installations. And Cassie put that in the incident log with the bleak satisfaction of someone who knows the paperwork will be filed long after the situation is resolved. She opened a channel on Dominion Standard. Vessels. This is Deep Anchor Station 12, United Earth Relay Authority. You are operating in a designated human buffer zone. Please, reduce speed and identify your mission parameters. The response was immediate, which told her they'd been tracking the station. Station, this is Commander Vork Prime's retrieval fleet. We are in pursuit of Dominion property. Stand down your deflectors. Cassie had spoken to Vorkai officials before. She knew their voices, the flat, slightly pressurized quality of their speech, the way they front-loaded authority into every sentence, the assumption that they would be obeyed. She had spent 10 years learning not to be intimidated by that quality, and she had mostly succeeded. I'm afraid I can't do that, she said. The deflectors are safety equipment, and I'm not authorized to disable safety equipment without a station-wide maintenance review. Could schedule one for... Let me check my calendar. I could probably get to it in about 72 hours. Station. In the meantime, if you'd like to submit your transit documentation for the buffer zone, I can process it in approximately the same time frame. There was a pause that had nothing of uncertainty in it and everything of calculation. You are harboring Dominion property, the voice said. That individual and their companions represent a significant investment in... I'm sorry, are you describing people as property? Under Dominion Integrated Resource Law, the Skrull are. We don't recognize that law in this zone. Cassie kept her voice level. She was watching the tracking display, watching the refugee ship's blip, threading between asteroid signatures, moving deeper into the belt. Vrob, she had been told, was flying. She hoped Vrob was as good with ships as with refit engines. I'm going to need you to hold your current position pending review of your transit documentation. Any further movement toward the station will be logged as a hostile approach and trigger our automated defense response. You have automated defenses? Cassie looked at the relay array console. Deep Anchor Station 12 had one emergency laser designator, intended for deflecting micrometeorites. It had a rated range of approximately 2 kilometers. The interceptors were currently 30,000 kilometers out. We have automated defenses, she said. She bought them another hour. She did it through the old technology, available to someone sitting alone at a communications console, with a hostile fleet on the line. She kept talking. She filed transit documentation requests. She had a prolonged technical discussion about the exact boundary coordinates of the buffer zone that required her to read extensively from regulations. She requested command-level authorization codes before she could process any Dominion vessel's approach, then explained at length what command-level authorization codes were and how they differed from standard-level authorization codes. Commander Reyes joined her at the 50-minute mark, took one look at the situation, and started talking too. By the time the lead interceptor decided that procedural compliance was no longer its primary interest and began advancing, the refugee ship's blip had gone cold in the asteroid belt, destroyed, just invisible, tucked behind a rock formation the size of a city block, drive powered down, everyone aboard presumably very quiet and very still. Cassie had 3 minutes between the moment the interceptors crossed the buffer zone boundary and the moment they would be close enough for any action she took to matter. She spent those 3 minutes doing something she had thought about since the first hour of the crisis and had kept pushing back against because it was not standard procedure, not authorized, not in any protocol she had ever been trained on. She ran the original signal, Scree's guitar signal, the one she'd nearly deleted at 0347, through the relay array at full broadcast power. Not at the interceptors, at the asteroid belt, at the rock where the refugee ship was hiding, and past it, deeper into space, in the direction of human-inhabited systems, where other relay stations would pick it up, where it would bounce and amplify, where it would eventually reach people who had offices and authority, and the ability to respond to a diplomatic incident with something more substantial than a micrometeorite laser and a very patient voice. The signal went out. On the tracking display, the lead interceptor paused. The Vorkai, Cassie would later learn in the post-incident debrief, had never encountered a full array broadcast at that frequency and that power. It was not a weapon. It was not a threat in any measurable physical sense. It was music, fragmented, corrupted by 42 light minutes of travel, layered now with the acoustic signature of the relay array which gave it a deep, bell-like resonance that the original signal had not had. The translation matrix could not process it because it was not language, something that existed before language. Or maybe alongside it, or maybe it was the part of language that dictionaries couldn't capture. The interceptors held their position for 4 minutes. 4 minutes in a pursuit situation was an eternity. The interceptors moved again at the 4-minute mark, and Cassie stopped pretending she had good options. "Scree," she said on the refugee channel. "I'm going to need Vrob to do something complicated." "Vrob is ready." There was no hesitation. She had noticed this about Scree. He did not waste time catastrophizing. He assessed, and he acted. It reminded her of every engineer she had ever respected. The lead interceptor's drive signature is broadcasting on a standard Dominion maintenance frequency. That frequency is essentially the same as a remote access carrier wave. If Rob can get within 15,000 kilometers of the lead ship and send a specific command string. "Vrob has been listening to this conversation," Scree said. "Vrob says she can do this if you send her the command string. I need to figure out the command string first." "How long?" Cassie was already typing. 8 minutes. The lead ship will be at the station in 6. Then I need 7 minutes. She heard something in the background, Scree's voice, and then another voice, lower, with a texture like metal under stress, which she would later learn was Vrob. There was a brief exchange. Vrob says 7 minutes is enough if you sense the string incrementally, and she begins integration before you finish. "Tell Vrob I like her already." It was not a clean operation. Cassie sent the command string in fragments, and Vrob integrated each fragment into a transmitter cobbled from the ship's own communication array, and 2 components that Vrob described through the matrix as not technically being components, meaning she had disassembled something else to get them. The lead interceptor reached the station's visible range with 2 minutes of command string left to transmit. Commander Reyes activated the micrometeorite laser, which the interceptor's threat sensors apparently registered, because the ship slowed. Not by much, not by enough, but by something. The last fragment went through. Cassie held her breath. On the tracking display, the lead interceptor's drive signature stuttered. Then it changed. Rob had not disabled the drive. Cassie had not asked her to. A disabled ship would still be present, still be a problem. What the command string had actually done, in the 30 seconds that Cassie had spent staring at Dominion maintenance protocols with a kind of focused desperation she had not felt since her doctoral qualifying exam, was change the navigation preset. Not override the crew, not seize control, just update the preset. The default fallback course that the ship would snap to if it lost coherent navigation signal, to a vector that pointed, roughly, toward the outer Keeper belt. When the crew attempted to correct their stuttering drive, they restored power to navigation first, as standard Dominion protocol required. Navigation, reading the preset, plotted a course correction to match. Course correction fired the main drive in entirely the wrong direction. The lead interceptor shot away from the station on a long arc toward the outer system. The two remaining interceptors held position. Through the channel, Cassie heard their communications. She couldn't translate fast enough to catch it all, but the emotional tenor of what two military ships sound like when one of their colleagues has just malfunctioned spectacularly in front of a foreign installation was recognizable across any language barrier. Then Scree was on the channel, and he said, "Cassie, the commander's ship is trying to hail the others." Picking up the frequency. "Don't tell me," she said. "Tell Vrob." A pause. Then Vrob's voice, not through the matrix, raw and untranslated, the low metallic resonance of it filling the channel, and under it Cassie could swear she heard the quick rhythmic background of someone typing very fast. The second interceptor's navigation stuttered 17 seconds later. The third 31 seconds after that. Two ships went into the outer system. The third, the one carrying Commander Vork Prime's direct representative, a Vorkai official whose rank was the equivalent of something between admiral and viceroy, had a more experienced crew. They corrected faster. They were still in the vicinity when Reyes opened a formal channel and delivered, in the stiff measured language of diplomatic incident management, the United Earth Relay Authority's official protest regarding unauthorized entry to a buffer zone and operation of military vessels in the vicinity of a civilian installation. The Vorkai official's response included a demand for the return of Dominion property. The Vorkai official also, in the course of that demand, referred to Cassie by the translation matrix's approximation of her station designation, which came out sounding vaguely like "noshed operator." Not intentionally derogatory, probably. Just the Dominion's way of classifying someone who worked with sound signals. Cassie at a direct channel. "I want to be precise at something," she said. The official granted the channel with the air of someone who expected to be annoyed. "Why, the people you're calling Dominion property are artists," she said. "They built a ship to escape a planet where government destroyed everything that made their civilization worth calling a civilization. They were drawn to human space by a radio broadcast, one song, on one frequency, from a species your command structure almost certainly has on file as technologically primitive and diplomatically negligible. They risked their lives to get here, not because they were running away from something, but because they were running towards something. They heard music, and they followed it across 40 light years." She paused. "The fact that your command structure cannot comprehend why someone would do that tells me a great deal more about your civilization's limitations than it does about theirs." The official said nothing. "In approximately 6 hours," Cassie continued, "the signal I broadcast from this station will reach the Titan relay, which will redistribute it to 17 inhabited systems. There are going to be questions asked. There are going to be a lot of diplomatic conversations. And I would like to have had this one first, on record, so that when those conversations happen, everyone knows exactly where we stand." She waited. "Where do we stand?" the official said, in the flat, pressurized voice of someone choosing their words. The Dominion does not recognize the legal standing of this station's buffer zone claims. I know. The Dominion will be submitting a formal protest regarding the interference with Dominion vessels. I know that too. We'll submit one back. That's what formal protest periods are for. The individuals you are harboring are guests of the United Earth Relay Authority, pending review of their status under the Solar Asylum Accords, which your government also doesn't recognize. I know. But we do. She straightened in her chair. Her back ached. She had been sitting at this console for, she realized, nearly 8 hours. I'd like to suggest that you retrieve your other 2 ships and return to Dominion space. I understand you have a monument to finish. She closed the channel before she could second-guess it. Reyes was standing behind her. When Cassie turned, she found her CO looking at her with an expression that was carefully neutral. You are going to be in a lot of paperwork, Reyes said. Yes, ma'am. That was also extremely well done. Thank you, ma'am. How long until the refugee vessel can safely dock? Cassie checked the tracking display. The 3rd interceptor was moving. Slowly, then faster, heading for the buffer zone boundary. Heading out. Their drive needs about an hour to cool after what Vrob did to it. Then another 2 hours transit time. 3 hours, Reyes nodded. I'll have berthing ready. And coffee, I think. I suspect there will be a great deal of talking. There was. The Skrull docked at deep anchor. Station 12, 16 arms, station time. Nearly 12 hours. After Cassie had first pulled a corrupted signal out of the delete queue and heard a guitar in the noise. There were 11 of them and they were. She didn't have adequate language for what they looked like. Not human. Nothing like human. They were a species that had evolved in low gravity, long-limbed, and hollow-boned, with facial structures that reminded her, in form if not in detail, of deep-sea creatures, and eyes that processed a color range that human instruments registered, but human eyes didn't. They were also clearly exhausted. The bone-deep exhaustion of people who had been living on a knife's edge for weeks, and who had finally arrived somewhere that was not trying to kill them, and didn't quite know yet how to stand in the presence of safety. Scree was taller than she'd expected. He had a way of holding himself that was simultaneously carefully controlled and barely controlled, and he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. Came through the matrix was, "You sound different in person," Cassie said. "So do you." He carried one of the instruments himself. A stringed thing, double-necked, with resonators along its body that she realized when he moved were still vibrating slightly from the trip. Not playing, just responding to the ambient sound of the station. The ventilation hum, the distant clank of the docking clamps, the murmur of crew coming in to see what the fuss was about. "That's an interesting instrument," she said. "It's old," he said. "Older than I am. They tried to take it 3 times. 3 times we hit it." He looked at it with an expression that she recognized across all the distance of biology and culture as love. It is very difficult to hide something this size. I imagine. But you learn. He looked back at her. You learn what things are worth the difficulty. Behind him, Vrob had already detached from the group and was examining the docking bay's engineering panel with the focused attention of someone who could not help improving things. 2 of the other Skrull were talking quietly among themselves. The translation matrix picking up fragments. Something about acoustics, about the station's echo properties, about whether the ventilation frequency would interfere with a low string. Cassie watched them, take in the space not as a shelter, but as a room where something might be played. "I need to ask you something," she said. Scree waited. "The signal you were broadcasting, the one I first detected, that wasn't distress. That wasn't a navigation beacon. That was a song." "Yes, you were broadcasting music into interstellar space while 3 military ships were chasing you." Yes, she waited for the explanation. He let the silence sit for a moment, not uncomfortably, just letting it breathe. "If the Dominion catches us," he said finally, "they will say we were noise. They will say we were disorder, that we had no function, that there was nothing in us worth preserving. They call us property, but what they mean is that we are nothing, that we became nothing the day they arrived. Because the things that made us something they cannot use. He paused. I wanted there to be a record. Not a distress call, not a legal argument. Record that said, we were here, and we made this, and this is what we were. So that if they caught us at least, that had gone out. At least something had gotten away. The station hummed around them. Cassie thought about her grandmother, who had said that music was proof the universe wanted to feel something. She thought about the diagnostic console, where she had spent 19 hours in the dark, and the moment a pattern had snagged her hand before her brain had processed it as music. She thought about the specific human wiring for rhythm and melody, the thing that researchers had argued about for centuries. Whether it was adaptive, what it was for, whether any other species had it. The Dominion had called it noise, had called it non-functional vibration. But the Skrull had followed a human signal 40 light years because they recognized it. You didn't follow noise 40 light years. You followed music. For the record, she said, I heard it. Scree looked at her. The signal, she said. I almost deleted it. The filter called it noise. But I heard it before I knew what it was. Before the processor confirmed it. Before any of this, she gestured. At the station, at the diplomatic catastrophe she'd spent the last 12 hours constructing. At Vrob now cheerfully disassembling something that Cassie hoped was not load-bearing. I heard the rhythm in it. I pulled it back from the delete queue. It's what started all of this. He was quiet for a moment. You heard it, he said. I heard it. Something shifted in his expression. She didn't have the biological reference points to decode it with confidence. But it felt like relief, the specific relief of someone who had been holding a doubt for a long time and has just been given permission to let it go. I wondered, he said, if we had chosen the right direction. You did. From the back of the group, someone had taken out a smaller instrument, hand-sized, that produced when plucked a sound like water and like metal at the same time. The notes moved through the docking bay, and the ventilation hum rose to meet them, and Vrub looked up from the engineering panel, long enough to adjust something, and the ambient hum shifted a quarter tone. And suddenly, the room had better acoustics than it had any right to have. Cassie sat down on one of the equipment crates and listened. The diplomatic fallout lasted 14 months. There were formal protests filed in both directions. There were 7 rounds of negotiation between United Earth representatives and the Dominion Coordinating Council. There were 3 separate UN Security Council sessions. There were op-eds and documentary proposals, and one very confused congressional hearing in which a senator from Missouri attempted to explain the Vorkai Integrated Resource Doctrine and gave up halfway through and just played a clip of the signal instead. The Skrull were granted provisional asylum status under the Solar Accords in the 4th month. The Dominion contested it. The provisional status was maintained on the grounds that the Dominion's legal claim over the Skrull constituted a category of ownership that human law did not recognize and could not validate. This was the diplomatic version of saying no, and it was said very firmly, in a great many languages, by a great many people, over several years. Cassie testified twice. She brought her logs. She brought the incident record. She brought the original signal, raw, unprocessed, the way she had first heard it. And she played it for the committee room, and the room was quiet for the duration. Rob, for her part, became briefly famous in certain engineering circles for what she had done to 3 military-grade interceptors with a transmitter built from what Scree described, upon repeated questioning, as parts that belonged to something that had stopped working. Several papers were written about the technique. There was some argument about whether it constituted a weapons application, which was resolved when the paper's authors pointed out that the ships had not been harmed, only confused and only briefly, and in a direction that took them away from anything that could be damaged. The Skrull eventually settled, not on Earth, which was offered and gently declined, Scree explaining with characteristic directness that Earth had too much gravity, and they would find it physically taxing in the long term. But on Callisto Station, which had been partially decommissioned, and which the UN offered to let them refit as they chose, they refitted extensively. Rob improved the acoustics first. Cassie attended the first concerts 3 years after the night she had pulled the signal from the delete queue. She took the transit from Titan, which she disliked because the cabin pressure settings were tuned for people who didn't work on low-pressure outposts, and arrived at Callisto Station with a mild headache and the particular anticipation of someone who has been looking forward to something for a long time and is slightly afraid it won't be what they hoped. Shh. It was better. The hall that the Skrull had built inside Callisto Station's primary dome had acoustics that had spent 6 months designing and 3 months correcting and 2 further months adjusting in ways that she refused to explain, on the grounds that explaining would take longer than just listening. The ceiling was curved in a way that caught sound and redistributed it so that the music arrived from every direction at once, filling the space the way light fills a room rather than projecting from a single point. There were perhaps 300 people in the hall. Skrull, mostly, but humans too, and 2 representatives from another species that had recently entered preliminary contact with the Solar Authority, and 1 Vorkai expatriate who had defected a year after the incident, and whose presence was, Cassie had been told, both politically complicated and musically enthusiastic. Scree came out last. He had the double-necked instrument, the old one, the one that had been hidden 3 times. He held it for a moment, in the curved light of the dome, and then he looked out at the hall. He found Cassie in the crowd the way people sometimes find one specific face, without apparent effort, as if drawn. He smiled, or whatever the Skrull expression was that occupied the same emotional territory as a smile. She had learned to read it over 3 years. Then he began to play. The music was nothing like the corrupted, attenuated signal she had heard on that first night. It was the signal's full self, undamaged, at proper volume, in a room built to carry it. It was nothing like the human music that had drawn them across 40 light years. It was Skrull music. 10,000 years of it condensed into 1 voice and 20 strings. And it did what music does, which is that it moved through the air and into people, and made them feel things that would not fit inside words. 300 people, human, Skrull, 2 other species, 1 defector, sat in the acoustic perfection of Callisto Station and listened. On the night that the signal had come in, the autofilter had called it noise, non-functional, without result. Cassie sat in the hall and thought about that word, result, and found it insufficient. T-roots. There were things that happened in the body when music moved through it, things that neurologists had measured and musicians had always known, that it did not resolve neatly into the category of function. They were older than function. They were the part of life that had insisted on existing before anyone had worked out what it was for. The Vorkai had built an empire on the premise that these things were expendable, that a civilization stripped of them was still a civilization, that you could take away the song and keep the people. But the people had followed a song 40 light years and built a ship in a mean shaft to do it. And the people had arrived here, and the song was playing, and the hall that Rob had built was full to the edge of its acoustic capacity. And Cassie Voss sat in the middle of it and let it move through her. She had an incident report to finish. She had a consultation scheduled on 3 relay stations that needed refitting. She had 400 unread messages and a Senate subcommittee that wanted her again in the spring. All of that was true, and all of it could wait. Right now, in the curved light and the perfect sound of a room built by people who had crossed 40 light years for the chance to play in it, she listened. She had always been good at that. It was, in the end, what had started everything, not the authorization codes, or the deflector protocol, or the Dominion command strings, not the diplomatic maneuvering, or the incident log, or the 14 months of formal protest. All of that had come after. What had started it was simpler. Human ear in the dark, and a pattern in the noise, and a hand that stopped before it hit delete. The music played. Outside the dome, in the cold and the silence of the outer system, the relay array broadcasted outward. Not at full power this time, not as a tactical signal, just outward, as relay arrays do, the way they had always done, carrying human transmissions into the dark without asking who might be listening. The universe, Cassie's grandmother had said, wants to feel something. She had not been wrong.